Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asma Arshad Mahmood, and I am the Artistic Director for Canadian Community Arts Initiative. Welcome to an evening with award-winning historian William Dalrymple. I would like to thank Luxe Convention Centre for this beautiful facility. We recognize Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, Government of Ontario, City of Mississauga, and Mississauga Culture Division. I recognize Lata Pada from Sampradaya here. I recognize Charles Pachter, the Canadian artist, Mike Douglas from Mississauga Arts Council. Thank you very much for being here as our guests. We are pleased to collaborate with Canada Literature Festival in presenting this event. Of all the words I could choose for William, one stands out: delightful. It was his masterpiece, White Mughals, that first revealed to me how profoundly captivating history can be in the hands of a master storyteller. The Canadian Community Arts Initiative, in launching his last 3 books, recognized a vital truth. William's historical accounts are uniquely compelling. He approaches the past not merely with curiosity, but with a profound sense of empathy. He wisely resists the temptation to sit in judgment, skillfully avoids presentism to clear away the distortions sown by lazy historians and ideological zealots. His work, particularly The Golden Road, is a shining example of this fullness. It revives our imagination of ancient India, bestowing vitality and validity to connect with the very origins of successful societies, and to understand how they can fade into obscurity through time and conquest, while their essential spirit endures. He breathes life into history, transforming it into the living, breathing entity that is the Indian subcontinent. We can thank William for his research and hard work by buying millions of his books and attending hundreds of his talks. But the greatest thanks we can offer is to applaud the deep humanity and compassion that illuminates his historical accounts and his contemporary activism. For fellow history enthusiasts, I must also recommend the Empire podcast, an essential listen to, created by William Dalrymple and the brilliant Anita Anand. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do. You will find a new world opening right in front of you with this podcast. So, without further ado, folks, William, you better be there. William Dalrymple!
There we go. Simic, I'm very confused. You're all on time.
Whatever happened to the concept of Indian flexible time? What has Toronto done to you all? I was expecting people to start wandering in about 7:30. South Asia is one of the few parts of the world that very early came up with a set of profound answers to the basic, most important questions that man asked of himself. What are we doing here? Why are we on this earth? What is the nature of this earth? What is the relationship of this earth to the sky, the heavens, the moon, the sun? Now, South Asia was not alone in this. There were other parts of the world that also provided profound answers to these questions. Most obviously and most widely taught in the West, ancient Greece, but also China. And the Chinese version of these answers have become, I think, more widely understood lately, thanks particularly to the popularity of this idea of the Silk Road. Anyone brought up anywhere in North America or Europe will from very early on have been taught about the great thinkers, particularly in mathematics by the age of well, what do you think, 7 or 8, most of the people in this room that went to school in this part of the world would have learned about Archimedes in his bath, shouting Eureka. By the age of 10, probably, Pythagoras and his theorem. But very few people that went through a Western education will ever have come across their equivalent figures in South Asia, who are absolutely the equal and in many ways more important for our contemporary mathematics and science than the ones we were taught at school. To give an example, Aryabhatta, a name familiar to Indians who went through particularly the kind of nationalistic Indian education system in the 1950s and 60s, but completely unknown in the West, completely and utterly off every syllabus. Even PhD students in the history of mathematics often don't know this name. Yet Aryabhatta realized by about 500 AD or 400 AD that we live in a heliocentric universe, that the Earth revolves around the sun. He calculated exactly the circumference of the Earth and the distance of the Earth to the Moon and the Sun. 1,000 years before Galileo. His work then was taken forward a century or so later by another great Indian sage, Brahmagupta, again a name that will draw complete blanks on any Western education syllabus. Brahmagupta, meditating on the concept, the very Indian concept of sunya, the void, came up with precise definitions of zero. Now, zero is a concept that in various forms has been around since ancient Babylonian times, but Brahmagupta's contribution was to realize that it wasn't just an absence or a placeholder between positive and negative. It was a number in its own right with its own properties. And he went on to define those properties. It is, for example, the number you get when you subtract a number from itself. He provides 40 or so rules like that. Now, once you've got zero as a number, you then can have place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. You can have algebra. You can have algorithms. The whole of higher mathematics opens up before us. And it is from Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta that we get the number system we use to this day. This is the greatest contribution, arguably, of South Asia to the world. And yet in the West, we call it Arabic numbers. Not completely wrong in that Europe in the Middle Ages did indeed get it from the Arab world, but the Arabs get it before that from India. And that's acknowledged in Arabic, where this number system is known still as Hindu numbers. This was something also that was acknowledged in the medieval West, where they were also known as Hindu numbers. But it's something that around the same time as colonialism took over South Asia, miraculously got removed from the nomenclature and the syllabus. And so we've forgotten this crucial, basic, fundamental part of human civilization, which derives from the Indian world. As I said at the beginning, Greece is something that we have always been taught in the West, and it remains at the center, at the core of many conceptions of the syllabus, and the idea that Western democracy and Western civilization developed out of Greece and Rome is still something that is taught in some quarters. Although, as I will argue here, so much that we think of as the West actually derives initially from Eastern thinkers. But China, I think, is an example of how it's possible to change perceptions. And over the last 40-odd years, China has been very successful in projecting its ideas. And this, I think, this conception of the Silk Road is something which is at the heart of that project. Now, the Silk Road is an idea, well, first of all, it's a very attractive idea. The idea that there is a wonderful east-west highway starting in the Mediterranean, crossing the center of the world, the thin waste of Asia, and arriving in the South China Sea, that it carried civilization ideas backwards and forth from distant antiquity to the present is an idea which breaks us out of our narrow nationalisms and makes us understand that globalization is something which has been going on for a long time. But it's also an idea which I think has many problems. And just to emphasize, it is an idea, and it is an idea with a very recent history. No medieval source, Eastern or Western, talks about the Silk Road. Marco Polo never mentions a Silk Road. In fact, it was invented in 1877 by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen, the grandfather of the First World War flying ace, the Red Baron, who came up in a German geography book with the idea called the Seidenstraßen, the Silk Road, which was his idea of a possible railway line that would, a colonial railway line that would link Berlin with Beijing. It was never built, but the idea was established. First appears in English in 1936 as the title of a memoir of Eastern travels by a Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer called Sven Hedin. And by the 1980s is taken up by the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where the Silk Road shows in the 1980s, then in the National Gallery in Washington. Begins this idea of the Silk Road, which works at every level. It's wonderful. It's two words, Silk Road. Does a lot of work. It works at a popular level of Netflix dramas of Marco Polo cavorting with Mongol princesses. It works at the scholarly level. You get professors of Silk Road studies now. It works at the level of university syllabi. It works at for conferences. It works at the level of geopolitics. And indeed, the Chinese have weaponized the idea of the Silk Road to build their concept of the Belt and Road on top of this idea. The Belt and Road is foundational to this idea that there was an East-West contact, which is now being revived. The trouble is that this idea, for much of its history, obscures the truth as much as it illuminates it. Because as this map shows, this lovely, sexy idea with its Silk Road cities like Merv, Samarkand, Tashkent, each one of those sort of whole worlds rise before us as we say those words. Ideas of camel caravans crossing the sand dunes of Dunhuang and heading on to Chang'an and so on. But look at South Asia. It's completely out of the picture here. So much so that, in fact, there are no cities in this version of India, as it labels it. Himalayas at the top. Even the maritime routes don't bother stopping in South Asia because there's no reason to stop there. It's just an empty space. And this is true of this concept. It is a concept which explains East-West communications in a very Sino-centric manner, and which privileges, obviously, silk, and the conception of East-West travel being between the Mediterranean and China. Now, it is the central idea of my book, The Golden Road, that the Silk Road did not exist in any meaningful form before the Mongol conquest created it. Genghis Khan destroys the civilizations of Persia, which always acted as a block between East and West. Persia was the great rival of Rome and Byzantium, and for 1,000 years was at war with first Rome, then Byzantium, which meant that it was almost always impossible to move overland easily from Mediterranean to China. But the time it becomes not only possible, but very easy, is during the Mongol conquests, when Genghis Khan destroys everything in the way, opening up the whole of the middle of Asia. And in 1271, Marco Polo, with a Mongol passport, does indeed pass from the Mediterranean to Shangtu, Xanadu, as Coleridge calls it, and in a matter of months. But what is the situation in classical antiquity? Because many versions of the Silk Road imply that this same East-West contact was possible in the classical period. And this map, taken at random from some of the 40 books published on the Silk Road in the last decade, also implies that with its choice of names, Antioch, Palmyra, Gaza, these are the great classical ports that didn't continue to be greatly important into the Middle Ages. Palmyra, these are classical names. Now, the reality is that we do not know of a single merchant or embassy who definitely made the journey from Rome to China or from China to Rome in the classical period. Only towards the very end of the Roman era do you have vague conceptions in some merchants' manuals of a place called Thys or Ceres, where silk comes from. Only in very late Han times do we get some mention in some manuals of a power to the west called Darquin, which may or may not be Rome. But we literally do not have one piece of evidence that actually substantially links the Mediterranean with the Chinese world. There is certainly, if you like, capillary trade. So, an item can, over a course of 100 or 1,000 years, pass slowly from hand to hand. So famously, there's that wonderful Swat Buddha, which found its way to Sweden in Viking times, probably through many hands en route. But the idea that you could just set off from Rome or from Antioch or from the Eastern Mediterranean, find yourself in Chang'an or the Tang capital, is complete ahistorical nonsense. In contrast to that, we know from a million classical sources that India was the largest trading partner of Rome. Pliny calls India the drain of all the precious metals in the world. Strabo, his contemporary, a geographer in Alexandria, takes the new Roman governor of Egypt on a tour of his new territories and describes a fleet of 250 vessels waiting at Myos Hormuz to make the annual sailing fleet to India. And archaeology backs up these literary sources very clearly. Now, if the Silk Road actually existed in classical times, you'd expect to find Roman coins, for example, stretching along it, linking the two. Archaeological evidence substantiating this idea. Luckily, Oxford University last year made such a map. Let's have a look at it. Here it is. Every one of those little orange dots represents a Roman coin hoard. In other words, 100 or more Roman coins buried in a pot somewhere that have turned up. As you'd expect, most of them are in the Roman Empire, in France, Spain, Italy, Greece. Outliers around the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the North African coast, and the Nile. But look along that horizontal line that we saw in the last map, and there's hardly anything. Odd orange dots up in Swat and Afghanistan, but look down here at South Asia. A mass of orange coins, because in India have been discovered more Roman coins than in any other country outside the Roman Empire. They have more Roman coins in Indian museums than anywhere else outside the core Roman provinces. And all this leads me to feel very strongly that the idea of the Silk Road, attractive as it is misleading when we're talking about ancient history. Instead, the principal trading partner is not China, but India, and the principal means of transport is not over land, but the maritime monsoon trade route. And this was a very easy journey. Leaving India, you could just sail past Aden into Roman Egypt in 6 weeks. You then have to wait for the winds to change, because the winds reverse. The monsoon winds change direction. And when the winds reverse 3 or 4 months later, you can come back with equal speed. So it's perfectly possible to make in 1 year a journey from Kerala or Gujarat or Sindh to the Roman coast of Egypt, and back with your fortune. So I'm going to propose in the next half hour 3 principal bodies of thought which followed in the footsteps of this forgotten and massive monsoon trade. The first is the idea of Buddhism, an idea that's not necessarily always associated with India, because there's very little Buddhism in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh today. But it was, of course, an Indian idea. The Buddha was born on the banks of the Ganges, and it spread out from there. The second set of ideas is the whole body of work associated with Sanskrit, with Hindu kingship, and with the ideas of Sanskrit literature, which from about 600 AD to about 1200 AD forms the lingua franca all the way from Kandahar in Afghanistan to Bali in modern Indonesia. The third body of ideas is those associated with science, mathematics, and astronomy, which in ancient India is one science, Jyotisa in Sanskrit. And this body of ideas moves first to the Arab world in about 800, and we'll be talking about this at the end of the lecture, and finally, belatedly, makes it to Europe in the 12th century. Very late on in the history of these ideas, which had already been knocking around in India by that stage for 800 years. So let's start with Buddhism. So the first thing to be said, I suppose, is that the Buddha is a historical character. The Buddha existed in historical real time. He was born in Lumbini, now on the just over the border into Nepal. He had his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya in Bihar, and he preached his first sermon at Sarnath outside Varanasi in modern Uttar Pradesh. He lived in the mid-5th century AD. But one of the strange things about Buddhism is that these ideas do not leave that small area of the Gangetic plain for about 300 years. It takes one extraordinary chance encounter and one set of events in about 250 AD to change that. And this is the rise of the Emperor Ashoka. On the left, we have Ashoka's Lan capital at Sarnath, which now forms the emblem of the Indian Republic. It's on the banknotes, on the passport, and on every Indian banknote. Now, Ashoka invades Kalinga around 250 AD, and there's terrible carnage. A whole people are enslaved and led off in chains, terrible suffering, much bloodshed. And this leads to great soul-searching on the part of the emperor, who adopts, or certainly entrenches himself in Buddhist ideas in the years that follow. And Ashoka duly decides to spread his ideas with what he calls Dharma ministers. And he sends out missionaries into the world beyond his empire, down to South India and Sri Lanka, over into the Hellenistic world, where Seleucus and Antiochus and Ptolemy have taken over the empire that was built by Alexander the Great. And according to an inscription in Kandahar, these Dharma ministers got as far west as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. But it's first seen in the middle and the south of India. And this is the period around 200 BCE, 150 BCE, that we get the first wall paintings. We get the first spread of these extraordinary early Buddhist monasteries, the Bhaja preserving the shape of ancient Indian architecture in wood and bamboo, which is now lost. This is carved in stone, so it's survived. And we can see here ancient Indian apartment blocks. Look at these couples looking out of their balconies in these wooden high-rise apartments, which once existed in ancient India, now completely lost to archaeology because they're made of perishable materials. And at the center of every Buddhist monastery, the stupa, acting rather like a tabernacle in a Catholic church as the focus of the divine presence. And these ideas spread through the middle of India, right down to Sri Lanka, where Ashoka sends his son Mahinda to convert the king of Anuradhapura, then the second biggest metropolis in South Asia after Pataliputra, modern Patna. And his son Mahinda has great success. He converts the king of Anuradhapura, and Buddhism converts to, Sri Lanka converts to Buddhism. And these are the stupas and the sites associated with Mahinda, along with this, which is Mahinda's recently discovered stupa. This is a prototype of the much more familiar dome shape that we normally associate with stupas. This is just a ring of simple stones with, on one stone, the inscription of Mahinda on it. And in the centuries that follow, this extraordinary diffusion takes place. One of the great moments of world soft power, because these Buddhist ideas spread all over Asia without being forced on anyone by the sword. This is an empire of the spirit, not an empire of the sword. No armies disembark, no conquistadors spread a religious idea with the sword. It is entirely through missionary activity and the sophistication of these ideas that these ideas go first south to Sri Lanka and across to Burma, then up through Gandhara, through modern Pakistan and Afghanistan to modern Uzbekistan. Another set of ideas pass through Lhasa and Tibet to Dunhuang and beyond to Mongolia and beyond this map to Siberia. Others from Lhasa to Chang'an, modern Xi'an, Korea, Japan, and then down through Guangzhou, Canton, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, to the Philippines. And these ideas, spreading over about 300 years, transform the world. No Western education syllabus teaches this at any time, but it's one of the most extraordinary transformations in world history. And over a very short period of time, Indian ideas, Indian languages like Prakrit and Sanskrit, Indian ideas of non-violence and ahimsa pass right over this vast region and change it forever. Today, when you go to Vietnam or Laos or to Burma or to Myanmar or to Sri Lanka, you see Buddhist monks walking in the streets. Still, stupas everywhere, images of the Buddha. And this conquers even China. China, famously the most conservative and self-confident civilization in the world, arguably, which feels it has very little need of outside ideas, becomes a Buddhist country. And a world is transformed. And the degree to which that is a world, we're only beginning to realize now. When I was just finishing the book, this turns up, this extraordinary head of the Buddha. Where does it turn up? In a temple to the goddess Isis in ancient Egypt. And it's about as multicultural an object as you can imagine. In style, it looks like a Gandharan Buddha from Pakistan or Afghanistan. Yet it has these strange sunbeams, as if it's been crossed with some solar deity, whether it's Sol Invictus or Mithras or Surya. It's carved in white Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea, modern Istanbul. But the archaeologists tell me that the drill used to make what they nicely call the tortellini curls of the Buddha are from a drill that's only used in Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. So it's made by an Egyptian craftsman in an Indian style, or in, if you like, a Pakistani style, because you see Gandhara most in places like Peshawar and the Swat Valley, on what I suppose would now be regarded as Turkish marble in Egypt. And yet it records the arrival of an Indian sailor on the coast of the Red Sea. So it's a dazzling conjunction of worlds. And we now have to take in the fact that there were Buddhist monks wandering around ancient Egypt. And we have found now many Buddhist remains in Berenike and Myos Hormuz, the ports of the Red Sea. And by about 100 AD, this is what we're seeing. This is a map of a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea that sounds like some terrible Latin lesson that we used to take when we were 15 or something. But The Periplus in the Erythraean Sea is actually just a kind of rough guide to India for Romans, or the Lonely Planet of the first century. And what it shows is an incredible knowledge of every seaport on the West Indian coast. From Mussel Harbour, Myos Hormuz, and Berenike, ships passed every year down past Aksum, the Ethiopian kingdom, past what's now Aden, and then out either to Barbaricum, which is more or less modern Karachi. It's the mouth of the Indus port, or Barigaza in Gujarat, or hundreds of little ports running down the coast of Goa and the Konkan coast, and finally to Maziris, the great port of Kerala, the largest port of all. And a little knowledge of some of the East Indian ports, such as Tamralipti or Ganges, which is the mouth of the Ganges, or Poduku, which is modern Pondicherry. And what this map helpfully shows is the mass of Tibet. And that's important because it's the freezing of Tibet. Cold winds raking in November and December that begins the cold and the air's blowing in. Then come April, when Toronto has still got blizzards, there's a thaw. There is a thaw in Tibet, and warm winds begin to blow out, reversing the seas. So from one half of the year, an Indian said he's only got to put up a sail, and in 6 weeks he finds himself blown into the Red Sea. He then can go to Alexandria, sell his goods, see the pyramids, attend a show, that kind of stuff. And he has to be back on the shore of Berenike by August to catch the winds going home. And once you've learnt to surf these powerful monsoon winds, it's like you've got a jetpack on your back. Once you develop sails and boats that can withstand the heavy heaving seas of the monsoons and use the winds, not to sink you, but to drive you over the ocean, which man develops by about the 1st century BCE. Once you've mastered that and can go right into the deep water, then it's a very easy trip. And the result of this is a whole world of trade that we've forgotten. And we know the economic details of it thanks to this manuscript, the Maziris Papyrus. The Maziris Papyrus is much beloved of economic historians because it gives them hard data. What it is actually is just a shipping invoice of the sort that might be made in any Canadian port every day, giving the details of one container in one ship that happened to pass between Kerala and Alexandria in the First Sea. And the Indian supplier is writing down a list of the goods he's sending to Alexandria, and there are 3 columns in this: the goods, the price, and, in a nicely Trumpian touch, the tariffs. Because not something that could possibly happen today, but imagine that a ruler would put a 30% tariff on imports, to try and hinder trade between 2 previously wonderfully close and friendly states. But that's exactly what the Roman Empire does. And we shouldn't tell Trump, but it actually makes them a lot of money. And some estimates are that between 1/3 and 1/4 of the Roman imperial budget came from this tax on the Red Sea ports. Because what the Maziris Papyrus tells us that we didn't know before it was turned up about 20 years ago, was that Indian goods were hugely overpriced. They were expensive luxury goods that people in the Roman Empire paid an arm and a leg for. And what are these goods? Well, luckily we have in Sicily a mosaic that actually depicts them. Here in Piazza Armerina is a depiction of India as this sort of attractive, sexy, busty girl. Now, it actually is based, that's not the Western eye looking at this. This is actually based on an Indian model. These are Yakshi images. But you're not meant to be looking in the middle here. You're meant to be looking up here, where the Yakshi, who's this fertility figure, is touching the tree. And she's so incredibly fertile that the tree bursts into flower at her touch. Now, the Roman who copied this was also looking at the middle of the picture because he has missed the main point. He's just has her clinging onto a tree rather pointlessly. There's no blossoms there, missing the point entirely. But anyway, he understood what he was doing, and so what she's got is the products of India. Ivory. These are pepper vines, and these are specifically tigers and elephants from India for the Colosseum and the great circuses of India. And I didn't know this, to be honest. This picture appears in my book. I didn't know this about the mosaics around it till I visited Piazza Armerina a fortnight ago, a year after the book was published. And there is this wonderful scene next door to this, in the same expanse of mosaics, of a tiger, a Roman tiger hunt in India, capturing the tigers to send back to the circuses. You actually have pictures of people boxing these things up, putting elephants up gangplanks and down again the far side. And so there's a whole world of Roman trade depicted in these mosaics, which I had no idea about when I actually sent the book to press. And now the other interesting thing is, look, what has she got around her legs? She's got silk. Because the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, our lonely planet, says that if you want to buy silk, he doesn't know about China, so he can't send anyone off there. You want to buy silk, where do you buy it? You buy it in Gujarat. So if the Chinese and the Romans ever did meet, they probably met in the Keys of India. Because this is where Romans came to buy silk. And what's interesting is, look, you can see her limbs through it. Now, this is something that appalls Pliny, the same guy that says India's the drain of all the precious metals of the world. So Pliny would be definitely a sort of MAGA Republican if he was around today. Pliny is this sort of slightly frumpy, conservative naval commander from North Italy who can't stand what I think MAGA calls the metropolitan elite. And he is appalled that the money collected by the Roman, as he sees it, Roman naval heroes like himself, is being frittered away by the metropolitan elite on kind of immoral pornoware like this. And as far as Pliny is concerned, this is sort of Victoria's Secret plus plus. Because he says, why are these women in Rome turning up almost naked at parties with all their things showing? And here we see, you can actually see their flesh through it. This is deliberately painted. And we know at the same time that, for example, Nero had a mistress called Lolina Paulina, who used to turn up at parties wearing just a single layer of silk through which you could see everything, but also wearing on her head Indian pearls, in her tummy button Indian garnets, and on her shoes Indian pearls. Plus, in a nicely Punjabi touch, she brought the receipts to parties to show her friends how much she'd spent on it. As the host, our host is a Punjabi, we have to make this this point today. So we're in a very familiar world here. And so for Romans, buying Indian luxuries like pepper again, Pliny regards it as, I suppose, what Trump would call a woke spice. Why is anyone putting this black powder up? What's wrong with olive oil? You know, is sort of Pliny's view. Why would the young do it? Complete waste of money. And why would anyone buy silk? Why does anyone need ivory? You probably quite like going to the Colosseum, but anyway. So this is the equivalent, I don't know, getting stuck in Heathrow duty-free when British Airways cancels your flight, and you end up buying that really expensive Japanese whiskey and the Hermes scent that you can't afford, and lots of nice Hermes scarves that, you know, and you come home with all this stuff and get buyer's remorse. This is what Pliny is trying to talk about. But it was a huge bit of trade, and it was an annual trading fleet, and we've completely forgotten it. Scholars know all about this, but it's escaped the popular imagination. And if you look out in the archaeology, there are Indian objects turning up in archaeological digs all over Italy and the Mediterranean worlds, like these more sexy axes with all their bits showing. But you also get, of course, the reverse, because trade is two ways. So you get pictures of Russell Crowe as a gladiator, the lighthouse, Philos lighthouse in Alexandria, and the vintage, the harvest of the grapes. These are Alexandrian glass luxury objects that have turned up where? Under the American Air Force Base in Bagram that Trump wants back this weekend. So let's say he doesn't get them, because he'll probably build Pizza Hut on top of it. Anyway, so this is an important dialogue. And out of this dialogue comes all sorts of transformations in both East and West. And we'll talk about some of the transformations in the West later, but our focus is at the moment, let's just look at what happens in India. Early on in Buddhist art, you never show the Buddha. He's depicted as the wheel of law, a flaming pillar, or as a stupa. He's aniconic. Until the 1st century, when this trade really gets going, and then suddenly you get this sort of thing, these incredible, amazing Gandharan Buddhas, which look like Roman senators if you look at them carefully. And in particular, if you put them next to Augustus from the Capitoline Museum, look how similar these Gandharan Buddhas. Look at the drapery in the two. These are exact contemporaries, one in Rome, one in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Once you see them together, you can't ever unsee the similarities. And it's this joint Pak, Afghan, Roman fusion that heads on through Afghanistan. This is Mosaic, one of the first Buddhist monasteries in Afghanistan, about to be blown up by the Chinese. Those blue roofs behind are the Chinese mining barracks. And they're about to destroy this site. Why? Because it's on top of the biggest copper deposit on the world. And why do the monks build on top of a copper deposit? Because the monks were great capitalists. We have this very sort of Hollywood view of early Buddhism with sort of, llamas floating in the air like Marvel superheroes. So in reality, trade passes along the trade routes, along with Buddhist monasteries. The Buddhist monasteries lend money, have slaves, create the nuns mill cotton, and it is along the trade routes that Buddhism passes northwards through Pakistan, then eastwards into China. And the same forces which propel the merchants propel Buddhism. And it ends up by the 1st century heading into China, and you begin to see the Gandharan Buddha with Chinese-looking features from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD. First in Gansu in the West, you see Indian imagery coming into religious art. So this is a Bodhisattva from Mathura near Delhi, near Agra. This is a copy of that sort of thing in Western China from the 3rd, 4th century. We find very Indian-looking deities with very brown bodies and very Indian iconography flying over the domes of Silk Road monasteries in Western China. And by the 5th and 6th century, it's reached and become a major force in the Chinese court at Chang'an. And the guy that makes all the difference is this man, Xuanzang, a nerdy Chinese monk who wants to get the original sources of Buddhist monastic law and the Yogacara texts from, which were originally written by Asanga in what's now the Peshawar Valley and Taxila in Pakistan. But where does he want to get them from? He wants to get them from the main center of intellectual Buddhism, which is the Nalanda Monastery and Library. So he travels overland from Chang'an right across the Gobi and the Taklamakan deserts, cross Kashmir, down the Gangetic Plain, nearly gets sacrificed by pirates for Durga Puja, but makes it ultimately to Nalanda. And there he enters what is for him intellectual heaven. Oxbridge, Harvard, NASA combined. A 9-story library full of the greatest texts in the world. Anyone who's gone through a Western education knows about and mourns the Library of Alexandria. But this is its Eastern equivalent that only those brought up in India will have heard of. And remarkably, look at the plan. This is, when it's excavated, this is what we get. We get a courtyard with scholars' rooms leading off it in 2 stories. Where do you see that plan? Every college at Oxford and Cambridge. And you can make a very good example that this plan starts at Nalanda, passes through Takti Bai and the great Buddhist monasteries of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then gets transmitted into the shape of the Islamic madrasa and passes through Al-Azhar in Cairo and across the North African coast until it reaches Islamic Spain. And where do we get the first monasteries in Europe? Sorry, the first universities in Europe? We get them in Salerno, Bologna, Paris, on the edge of Islamic Spain. And then we get them a century later in Oxford and Cambridge. So this idea that a college should be off a courtyard with scholars' rooms on either side starts here and ends up in Oxford, ends up later at Harvard. So that's one thing, but the thing that really dazzles Xuanzang is the Library of Nalanda. He says you can study their texts on the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. He talks about the library, 9 stories high with 3 divisions: the Ratnadadi, the Sea of Jewels, the Ratnasagra, the Ocean of Jewels, the Ratnaranjaka, the Jewel Adorned. The priests, to the number of several thousands, from morning until night, the monks engage in discussion. The old and the young mutually help each other. Lectures are given in 100 different halls each day, and the students study diligently without wasting a moment. The atmosphere in the monastery is solemn and dignified. So he stays about 20 years there, copying out manuscripts. You can borrow any manuscript, he says, but you've got to return it to your pigeonhole in the central library every evening. No going to bed with manuscripts. And it wasn't just Xuanzang. We have this extraordinary copper plate surviving, which is the benefaction of the King of Indonesia, Srivijaya, setting up an expatriate college in Bihar, in Nalanda, for monks coming from Indonesia. So rather like, I suppose, you get the Harvard, the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard today, an Indian motor manufacturer giving a college to Harvard. In these days, you get the Srivijaya College at Nalanda, where foreign monks, and we know of other monks, not just from China, but from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and even North Korea. And this is a stamp showing what the library once looked like, 9 stories high. And when Xuanzang eventually makes it back to China, the emperor receives him, Taizong, and he builds a copy of that. We've lost largely, and this is all that's left of the Nalanda, just this brickwork. But the Wild Goose Pagoda, which is a copy of it in Chang'an, survives today, and you can go and see it. So the guy who builds it is this guy, Taizong, the Chinese Tang emperor, great hero of the golden age of high Chinese civilization. But the person who is most important in this story for us is his girlfriend, his last young concubine, who's an extraordinary woman called Wu Zetian. And Wu Zetian, not at all famous in the West, but there's a 250-part Chinese soap opera about her, telling her story. And she's important because for 2 reasons. One, she is the only woman to become an emperor in the Chinese system. You get dowager emperors and widows and powerful grandmothers and so on, but you don't get a woman becoming, another woman becoming full emperor in the Chinese system over 3,000 years of dynastic China. Only one, Wu Zetian. And she does this for the other reason that she's important, because she converts China to Buddhism, an Indian religion. How does she do that? Well, she does the equivalent of Project 2025, whatever it was. She has her own think tank called, rather sinisterly, the Scholars of the Northern Gate. And the Scholars of the Northern Gate are monks from Nalanda, largely, both Chinese and Indian. And they do what's effectively a kind of scholarly coup d'etat, they invent a whole load of bogus prophecies, which say that Wu Zetian is or rather they attribute to real prophecies bogus meanings, showing that she is the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. And she becomes this, she's a heavenly creature who must be obeyed. Again, it couldn't happen today. And well, here she is, and she has this extraordinary career where she starts off as the young girlfriend of Taizong, but then she manages to jump from him to his son's bed. Now, she doesn't look like she's up to much in this picture, but the Chinese soap opera makes the whole story come slightly more clearly to life. So she's a super hottie. And she moves from being the fancy girlfriend to being the rather terrifying wife of Gaizong, the son, until eventually he has a stroke and she takes over as empress in her own right. And she is the high watermark of Indian influence in China. For one reign, the Confucians are kicked out, the Taoists are kicked out, and the Buddhist monks control everything. And a bunch of guys from India turn up. Someone called, can't get more Buddhist name than Gautama Siddhartha, is in charge of the Astronomy Bureau, for example. So you've got a whole lot of Indians taking over, make India great again in Chang'an in early 7th century. Now, what's exciting is that it isn't just China. At the same time as Hoti Wu Zetian is taking over the throne of China, similar things are going on in Southeast Asia, except in Southeast Asia, it's not Buddhism, it's Hinduism. And it's not the merchants who are bringing it in this time, nor ambitious would-be emperors. It is the kings of Southeast Asia. Now, we were talking earlier in this lecture about the massive trade between Rome and India, and how India is the beneficiary of this, and you get this drain of wealth out of the Roman Empire into Indian pockets, which Pliny complains about. Well, a major crisis happens in India when Rome falls. 410, the Goths, then the Huns, then the Vandals, then all these other various barbarians, as the Romans call them, come sweeping over the Rhine through the Anatolian frontiers. And by the end of the 5th century, both Berenike and Myas Hormuz, the two big harbors in Roman Egypt that serviced the India trade, abandoned. And suddenly, India is not getting all the gold that it's been used to for the last 400 years. Indians have barely had to get out of bed for 400 years because Romans are just turning up and pouring out their gold in return for a few peppercorns and an odd bit of silk and a couple of rhino hinds and some ivory. But then, by this stage, there's already an institution capable of sorting this out. And this is the rather amazing guild called the 500. And the guild, the 500, is a Tamil and Karnataka institution, which is the closest thing in real life to the Iron Bank in Game of Thrones. And these guys are kick-ass. They have a corps of assassins that go after anyone that kills one of the merchants. They've got armed trade. They build their own forts. They're actually, I hate to say this in the South Asian Company, but they're a bit like the East India Company. They preempt the East India Company by 2,000 years. And these guys pivot eastwards, where previously the trade had been coming out of the west coast, looking towards the Red Sea. Now, the existing trade, which was already there between Eastern India and Southeast Asia, suddenly becomes the focus and is maxed up 1,000-fold. And out of a whole load of new ports like Tamralipti, which is very close to Calcutta, near Howrah, Nagapattinam, and Anuradhapura's port, which is Jambukola, you get this extraordinary range of fleets sailing out in boats like this for what they call, from this period, Suvarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. And the lands of gold are, the sources of gold at least, are Bujang in the Malaysian peninsula, Palembang in Sumatra, Java, Keling in Java, Kutai in Borneo. Kutai in particular is known in Sanskrit sources as Suvarna Dvipa, the island of gold. And when any of you leave freezing Toronto to go on a Christmas holiday in Thailand, you will fly into Suvarna Bhumi Airport to this day. So you begin to see this massive shift eastwards. And from the 5th century, 1,000 years after the death of the Buddha, you're suddenly getting Buddhist monks turning up in Malaysia at on the Malacca Straits, lingams, yonis, images of Lord Shiva. And in the Mekong Delta, you get these extraordinary canals crossing the delta and these wonderful, wonderful early Hindu temples. This is Ashram Maharose on the hill of Angkor Paray. And inside this temple, you get some of the earliest Hindu images, monumental Hindu images in Southeast Asia. From the beginning, Southeast Asian Hindu art does not necessarily follow the same rules as the rules in India. So this is Jayavarman II, who's the first emperor of Angkor. He shows himself holding a discus and a conch, which may seem pretty harmless until you realize that the discus and the conch are the signs of Lord Vishnu, which is basically saying, I'm a god king. Now, you don't get that in India. That would be intense blasphemy. And this is what's sort of going on. You've got some guy, Kodunga, a local chieftain with a moustache, sitting under a thing, while a whole bunch of sadhus, fresh from the Kumbh Mela with their little pots of water, perform the Abhisheka ceremony over this guy. And he becomes a Hindu king. And he moves from being Kodunga to being Mahendravarman, Suryavarman. He gets Sanskritized. He becomes a Hindu king with a new Sanskrit name. And with the new Sanskrit name comes a bureaucracy filled by the same Brahmins with their sacred cords that use Sanskrit language, but in the Pallava Grantha Tamil script. And this is the script developed in Kanchipuram in South India, which is the ancestor of both Malayalam in Kerala and Tamil in Tamil Nadu, and every single pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia. Pew, Khmer, Mon, Thai, Pew, a whole range of Southeast Asian scripts. And suddenly, where there had been no scripts before, no literacy, Southeast Asia develops literacy in Sanskrit. And the whole imagination, once Sanskrit is mastered, sees the lands of Southeast Asia as an extension of the Indian Holy Land. So you get, suddenly in Laos, a new Ayodhya, the capital of Lord Ram. Outside Bangkok, you get a new Ayodhya. In Laos, you get a new Kurukshetra, the great battle of the Mahabharata. And in time, every single great Shaivite shrine will have another version of itself in Southeast Asia, those great step pyramids in the Khmer Empire. And most remarkably of all, the rivers are converted into Indian holy rivers. They are turned by having lingams and yonis sculpted into their beds. And so the greatest river in Southeast Asia gets named Ma Ganga, or as that is pronounced in Khmer, Mekong. So you get the whole landscape reimagined as a Hindu holy landscape. And the whole eastern half of the Bay of Bengal becomes Hinduized at this period, 5th, 6th century. In due course, copies of Indian temples appear all over the region. So this is the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram, south of Chennai, famous to anyone that knows their Tamil movies as the background of every song and dance scene in Tollywood romances. And bing, suddenly here it appears in Gedong Songo in Java, just 6 years after this is built. Another version of it is built in Southeast Asia. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Southeast Asia, the kingdoms are so much larger and richer than their squabbling Indian counterparts. India, we should say very clearly at this point, is never a nation state. India is a place that has a strong self-conception as Bharat from the time of the Mahabharata, and the boundaries of Bharat are laid down very early. That is the Ganges to the east, the Indus to the west, the ocean to the south, and the Himalayas to the north. But within that, you get, well, at the time of Xuanzang, 70 warring kingdoms. And it's never one nation state. but it is a place that has a self-conception of itself as a cultural and geographical zone. And in India, it remains small competing polities. So the Pallavas are fighting the Chalukyas are fighting the Rashtrakutas, and so on. But in Southeast Asia, at this period, soon after the conversion to Hinduism and the arrival of these Hindu kings and the arrival of Sanskrit, you end up with two massive powers, Srivijaya, which is largely Buddhist, in what's now Indonesia, controlling the islands, what historians like to call a thalassocracy, an ocean kingdom. And in the land, the Khmer Empire, which, don't tell Mr. Modi, is the biggest and most powerful Hindu kingdom ever, a long way from India. And these powerful kingdoms can build bigger monuments than the monuments in India, because even the Cholas, with the great Chola temples of the south, are a fraction of the size of the sort of thing which begins to be built now. So Prambanan in Java is bigger than anything in India. You get the first ever Ramayana sequence in stone, not in India, but in Prambanan, 240 panels. This is Ram with the golden bow, shooting the golden deer as Lakshman looks on anxiously. In due course, Borobudur, the largest and arguably most sophisticated Buddhist monument to survive intact, appears in Java. And then at the culmination of this process, finally, Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu temple in the world, is built not in India, but in Cambodia. It's a Vishnu temple originally. And it's a whopper. It's the largest religious monument in the world from the Middle Ages. The outer moat encloses an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. 1.2 million people live in Greater Angkor at a time when 20,000 people live in London. But, as Tagore says when he visits Angkor, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her. Because the Hindu art and sculpture has gone off on its own trajectory. And there's nothing really terribly like this in India, though every individual element derives from Indian precedents. This temple does not look like a Chola temple. The quincunx, the shape of a 5 on the dice, 4 towers with another one in the center, is not a thing you get in India. Least of all do you get in India, in the central tower, the relics of the founders, Suryavarman II. In India, strictly, relics and burnt bone and cremations are taken outside the temple, on the ghats and in the chatris. But here they're at the center as the center of worship, like relics of the Buddha in the center of the monument. So it's the largest Hindu temple, and yet it's in many ways the least Indian of the Hindu monuments of Southeast Asia, because it's spun off on its own world. Anyway, we're going to go back 600 years for the last part of this talk, which is the maths. And this is all about numbers. And you can all read that, 270. Now, not only can you read, that is the very first circular zero in the world. We use it every day on our phones. Here it is in 9th century Gwalior for the first time. So we were in 12th century Cambodia. We're now going back to 5th century Madhya Pradesh, center of India. These are the great Gupta astronomy centers of Udaygiri. Here we've got Lord Varaha, the boar incarnation of Vishnu, stepping on the coils of a Naga king as water runs past him. This was originally inundated with water that was carefully regulated. And there, fresh from the gym, is the very well-managed pecs of Chandragupta II, the Gupta emperor, who oversees this massive reimagining of mathematics and science in his realm. And this is his wonderful gold coin. And the very first result of this, Aryabhatta writes his book, Brahmagupta writes his book, Zero, the Indian number system, also Kalidasa, the Indian Shakespeare, also the Kama Sutra. All these great landmarks of Indian civilization are happening at the same time in the Gupta realms. But we're focusing not on the Kama Sutra tonight, I'm afraid, but on Zero, which starts off initially just as a dot between these two padfoles in Cambodia in the 7th century, But our familiar 0 is shown for the first time in Gwalior. That's the oldest dated version of our 0 in the world. Actually, it's a rather boring inscription about the number of marigolds someone has to give to the temple each year, but it's a crucial landmark of science. And in this, we can see a number system that looks very like ours, with the 2, 3, 4, and 7 almost unchanged. Now, this map should be taught in every school in Canada, in fact, every school in the world, because it shows where our numbers come from, which no one is taught. Here's where it starts with the Emperor Ashoka. We can see 6 and 7 already. Then the Gwalior inscription I just showed you with the little round 0. And then it splits in 3. Sanskrit continues with these numbers. The Arab world develops this version of the 9 Indian numbers and 0. And then in Morocco and Islamic Spain, this variant, which becomes that variant, which becomes our numbers by the 16th century. Now, we are not taught this. We should know this. This is a basic facet of all our lives and everyone's civilization, and it's completely absent from our curriculum. Why is that? That's not what it should be in the 21st century. But the big question remains, how do we get from the Indian numbers to the Arabic and then the European ones? Well, quickly, improbably, through a Disney character. I'm not making this up. So this guy, anyone who's ever sat through the Disney Aladdin will know, is Jafar, who is the friend of Harun al-Rashid. He's a historical character. He's there in the Arabian Nights. He's there in the historical records. And he's from a family called the Barmakids. Now, the Barmakids, the name Barmak is a Arabicization of a Sanskrit word called Pramuk, which means boss. And the Barmakids were Central Asian Buddhist hereditary abbots from Balkh in Afghanistan who convert to Islam in the 7th century and bring Indian mathematics to the Abbasid revolution in the 8th century. When the Abbasids are trying to fight the Umayyads, they have Indian accountants, which is one of the reasons for their success. Hands up, the Indian accountants in this audience. Your ancestors were responsible for the building of Baghdad. And the Barmakids win over the war against the Umayyads. They're then given the keys of the kingdom. They're made the viziers of Baghdad. They found Baghdad. And the first thing they do is they send to the nearest Hindu kingdom of Sindh for a copy of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, a joint volume of both called the Great Sindh Hind. And it arrives in Baghdad. And for a generation or two, there's no very successful translation because the Sanskrit is so terse and difficult. It arrives with a bunch of holy men who interpret it. Even so, the early translations by Al-Farazi are not successful and not very useful because Aryabhatta not only writes this all in a tiny rhyming poem of only about 40 verses, it requires a complete commentary to unravel its secrets. But in due course, a genius appears who does produce a brilliant translation. And that man is called Al-Khwarizmi, the guy from Khwarazm, which is what's modern Khiva, Uzbekistan. And Al-Khwarizmi also seems to have come from a Buddhist background and to have had Sanskrit ancestrally. And he adds a bit of Euclid, adds a bit of this, adds a bit of that, and writes a book called The Compendious Book of Calculation by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Now that snappy title is even at the time realized to be a bit of a mouthful, and so people just know it by a nickname, which is algebra. While Al-Khwarizmi gives his name to algorithm. So it is in the meeting of Islamic and Indian thought that we get these two central concepts of science and mathematics, algebra and the algorithm. So this makes its way. So Sindh is where the Great Sindh Hind, the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Any Sindhis in the audience tonight? Yes, well done. You should be very proud. This is your civilization that starts this story. It's brought to Baghdad, and then Al-Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm and comes and translates it. And then this book spreads through Palestine, through Egypt, through Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and into Islamic Spain. And by 900, Indian numbers are being used in a Christian monastery outside Barcelona, just on the border with Christian Europe. Nonetheless, for a further 200 years, West continues to use the old Latin number system, MCV, XV1, XX1, CV, XV. Just try giving your phone number to your neighbor with Latin numerals. It'll take you half an hour. Try doing long multiplication with M's and V's and C's and see how far you get. So the West is lagging behind. And then, by pure chance, Pisa, as in the Leaning Tower, is getting left behind by Venice and its rival Genoa, and it decides to found a new trading colony in Algeria at a place called Bujaya, which is modern Oran, which is incidentally where Camus wrote The Plague. So Pisa sends a senior figure from the town council to found this trading colony in Algeria, and he brings his son. And his son goes to the local school, learns Arabic. Also, by that stage, just learns as a matter of course Al-Khwarizmi, which is used to teach teenagers all over the Islamic world up into Spain. And when, aged 18, that kid goes back to Pisa and finds all his friends are still struggling with MCV, XV, XV1, XX, he writes a book called the Liber Abaci, which explains this for his friends. And luckily, that kid is Fibonacci. So it's Fibonacci that takes this system that he calls the Hindu number system from the Arab world to Europe. Now, luckily also for us, because we'd all still be using MCV, XV1 except for this, he has an incredibly enlightened king. This is the Liber Abaci. And that king is Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. And Stupor Mundi goes and visits Fibonacci in Pisa. The king comes from Palermo in Sicily, all the way up the coast of Italy. It's a long trip. Where's the map? He comes from Palermo up to Pisa. Imagine Trump going to Toronto to meet someone that just got top marks in his maths exam. But he does. And he meets and quizzes Fibonacci, realizes how smart he is, and invites him to his court. And that summer is spent at Castel del Monte, the geographically perfect castle, where I'm glad to say he's introduced to a Scotsman, a crucial moment in this story. And that Scotsman is Michael Scott, who comes from very close to where I grew up to, in Melrose. And Michael Scott is the chief astronomer. And he reads the Liber Abaci, and rather than being sort of snotty and jealous of this kid who's clearly cleverer than him, he says, look, pal, this is all very well, but it's a wee bit theoretical. It's a work of genius, but it's a wee bit theoretical. And he says, you've got to make it more practical for merchants. So we've got to get usury, money lending, currency conversion, all the things that merchants can need to put all this theory into daily practical use. So the second edition of the Liber Abaci, dedicated to Michael Scott and to Frederick II, becomes the basic mathematical text behind the Italian Renaissance. It's the basis of the Medici Bank. It spreads to Tuscany, where Piero della Francesco, who we remember as the great painter of the flagellation, is remembered at the time as the greatest mathematician in Italy, other than Fibonacci. And he writes 3 mathematical treatises based on Fibonacci, whereby in one he develops the theory of perspective, which becomes the basis for Renaissance painting. In the other 2, develops ideas of algorithms and algebra and so on. And these treatises are carried by his friend Fra Luca Caroli when he dies, when Piero dies, to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's a jobbing painter, painting a painting of the Last Supper in Milan, Leonardo da Vinci. So in 5 leaps, you can go from Leonardo in Renaissance Milan to, I suppose, Fibonacci in Pisa and Algeria, to Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad, to Brahmagupta or Mount Abu in Rajasthan, to Aryabhatta in ancient Pataliputra in Bihar. And that's how we get our numbers. And no one knows it. Why do we not know this? Unfortunately, what happens next is that those numbers go to England and you get the East India Company. But that's a different story for another night. Thank you very much.
I had a question first.
Sure. You paid for my flight, so you definitely get that.
Okay, William, in an interview with James O'Brien, you claimed that India was the Greece of ancient times. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it does have this. It does have this ability to come up with new ideas, and it does that not in that way that Indian nationalists sometimes imagine, by being a sort of pure bit of sort of Tupperware sealed off, full of Shuddh Hindu sort of purity. It does it in the same way that Harvard comes up with new ideas, by being open to new ideas from around the world. And it takes Babylonian and Persian and Egyptian and Greek ideas, puts them all together, puts them in the Magi mix, and comes up with something new and fascinating and wonderful. So if you look at Ajanta, those wonderful frescoes, you see Egyptians, Ethiopians, Romans, Greeks, all Parthians, all coming into India. It's a big cosmopolitan center where ideas are discussed. And that's the mark of a healthy, developing civilization, when ideas are open and discussed. And what the mark of a decaying civilization is that by the 11th century, Al-Biruni says that the Brahmins don't like other ideas from outside. And that's the beginning of the decline, in a sense. And you could argue that Trump is the American equivalent of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. As always, it's fantastic. I was at the Festival of Authors last month listening to the same talk, but this time there's always something. Now, to keep it very short, Claude Markowitz, who writes in The Merchants of the Diaspora about the trade between Bukhara and Sindh. Could you tell us a little bit more about this, if you can?
So, one of the central ideas of this book is that I believe that the maritime sea trade is far more important than the overland trade. Obviously, you can fit far more in the hold of a big boat than you can in the saddlebag of a camel. And in general, in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, most long-distance travel happens by boat. So if you're going up, if you want to go from the north of India to the south of India, you go to Tamralipti and get a boat down to Muziris. You don't go on the roads on the way, through the jungles, over the rivers. It's also much more dangerous to go that way. So I'm trying to, in a sense, re-stress what should be blindingly obvious, that the sea roads and the river roads, the golden road as I call them, are more important than the overland routes. Yeah, well, exactly. Heroes of our time, exactly.
My name's Abhay Oberoi. Nice to meet you. So I kind of prepped this in advance. So given today's geopolitical tensions, and you made a few references in your talk today, you know, we've got trade wars, we've got debates over cultural heritage, the rise of nationalism and claims of civilizational purity, etc. What lessons do you think that the Golden Road holds for contemporary societies about intercultural exchange and pluralism?
Very simply, yeah, very good question. Very simply, that the more open you are and the more open you are to other ideas and to the trade of others and to the free mixture of peoples, the higher your civilization rises and the more your science and your arts develop. Because it is in human exchange that ideas develop and elaborate. And decay happens when conservatism and tradition and stability and the existing ways trump, that's the right word, trump development and imagination.
Thank
Your
you.
beer is here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Kay. Let's just leave it at that. And I'm extremely delighted to be having this opportunity. Sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm very overwhelmed right now. I'm trying to articulate what I wanted to say. So, hello, William. Hello, Asma. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. Okay. So my question really, I did not formulate it. Don't expect a very intellectual question from me. I just wanted to ask you, you kept alluding to the fact that I wonder why this is so. I wonder why people don't know about it. I was wondering, I mean, I started wondering about that as well. And you said how China has been able to change the branding, as
Yeah.
it were, or the perception. So why do you think it is? Like, what's your opinion? And is it something that India could do more, or is it something else that we could, that we
So I think
work?
part of the problem
Thank you.
that this is not wider known, and there's two answers to that. The first and easiest answer is colonialism. Colonialism privileges Western ideas and diminishes the ideas of the colonies. If you're claiming to be spreading civilization, you can't really admit that there's a great civilization 4,000 years older than your own, which existed before it. That's one answer. The second answer is, I think there's an element in which Indian overstatement of its ancient wisdom has led to an academic suspicion. So I'm sure many people in this audience have a crazy uncle who sends WhatsApp forwards about India inventing the nuclear bomb at the time of the Mahabharata, and how the internet was invented by rishis in Rishikesh, and all this stuff. And I think that's the reason why this book hasn't been written by an Indian scholar, because there's a slight sort of ick factor among real scholars about this whole line of thought that India is this great sort of mother of teacher of the world. And so there is a massive backlash, for example, in Southeast Asia against the very clear, obvious truth that India was a massive influence on Southeast Asia, partly because RSS and BJP scholars claim that this was a greater India that was conquered by the Cholas and was ruled from India. That was simply historical nonsense. So I think you have to, I think that there's an element in which India shot itself in the foot by inventing crazy, in frustration at the fact that no one does know this outside India, and the fact that Westerners call these numbers Arabic numbers. And all that leads to a sort of RSS, BJP, nationalist sort of fog of India first, like the person in the Sanjeev Bhaskar, goodness gracious me sketch. Leonardo da Vinci, Indian. Actually, he was Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's fantastic. My name is Manav Gupta. I just wanted to go to the heart of the essence behind the book. So the question that I have is about challenging preconceived notions. So how did you, I mean, we all grew up reading about the Silk Road, whether it's true or not, in whatever form. So how did you go back to challenging that, okay, there is something wrong with this idea? And then, did you happen to just chance upon a map that showed the findings of all of the Roman coins across India? Is that what germinated it? And the same thing applies to, for example, challenging it's not Arabic numbers versus Indian numbers and so on. So I'm just curious about the thought process.
So I mean, this came to me really, the idea of this book came to me on a visit to Angkor Wat, in fact, because every time I went there, I've been many times, and every time you go there, you see these Indian couples looking at the pictures of the Battle of Lanka or the Battle of Kurukshetra or Krishna and the Gopis and saying, what's that doing here in Cambodia? And the fact that even Indians don't really expect to find this Indian influence all over Southeast Asia. And then immediately after that, it was lockdown, and I got stuck at home with my library and just went down the rabbit hole at some length, and suddenly realized I had a book.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I just had a quick question, just to clarify perhaps maybe a historical myth.
Yep.
But you know, we are taught at some level that the descendants of Brahmins are the I guess you could say the steppe herder, the steppe herders that migrated into India and brought with them a proto Indo-European, let's say, ancestor to Sanskrit. And the descendants of these individuals are Brahmins. What do you say to that? And like, is there anything to clarify there?
So this is a huge issue, and I very consciously sidestepped it in the book. I don't mention this whole debate at all because it's hugely contentious. Everywhere outside of India, scholars believe that the Indo-European languages begin roughly on the front line between Russia and Ukraine in Donetsk and that sort of area, spread through the Black Sea and then diverge in two directions. One lot end up going westwards through Europe, through Britain as far as Iceland, and the other lot go through Swat down to India, which is why you have Indo-European languages spreading right across. Nationalist India has reacted against the overstatement of that idea in the myth of the Aryan peoples, because this was a set of languages, not a one sort of blonde group of peoples, by dismissing the whole idea, and in its most nationalist version, imagining that all this came out of India and went to Iceland. The latest thought seems to be that just as bubonic plague starts also in the Black Sea and spreads, a Genoese boat brings it to Europe, so it looks like the Indo-European speakers also brought an earlier form of pneumonic plague that was even more catching, and which wiped out all the people that they migrated towards. So that in the whole of Europe, there are only two language groups surviving that are not Indo-European. One is Basque on the French-Spanish border, and the other is Etruscans, an ancient Etruscan in the middle of Italy. Every other tongue in Europe is Indo-European. So you have these people migrating with a new language and bringing their own bacillus, rather like the Europeans wiping out the Latin Americans. These people seem to have had the same sort of catastrophic effect on the pre-existing populations. And there is going to be a big sort of bust up at some point, because more and more Indians believe that this originates in India and that the Aryan migration theory is completely wrong. It's partially wrong because it wasn't a people, it's a set of languages. And everyone else in the world doesn't believe this. So I kept away from it absolutely deliberately in this book because it erupts into an argument. If I'd given that answer even in India, there'd be people howling at me from the back of the room. But yeah, I think it's a major nationalist misconception myself. But I'm not an expert on this, I should say.
Good evening, William. My name is Arun. You're a great storyteller.
Thank you.
And your stories evoke a lot of emotions. I feel pride, a little bit of a sadness, the lost history, and I also see a little bit of a call to action, just like what China did. So I want to understand, since you published this book and having gone through all the tours, talking to lots of people, and giving a little bit of a receipt to the famous argument made by Dr. Shashi Tharoor that India does some sort of a repatriation. So it evokes all these emotions, knowing about this history. So what's the major emotion that you have seen people take away from this book? And how does that compare with what you expected when you set out writing this book?
So I think there is a genuine grievance here that the West has completely wiped out this whole story and does not teach it. And I think it's a very real grievance. I think, in a sense, it took a Westerner to write it because of the crazy WhatsApp uncle. So I had a lucky break in that. But I mean, I think people do feel very proud about this, and rightly so. And you're right. But China has shown us it can be changed. Narratives are open to retelling. This is not the end of history. And as India rises, India at the moment is the 5th economic power in the world. It's overtaken Britain. And in the next decade, it will inevitably overtake Germany and Japan and will be the third biggest economic power in a decade, if not sooner. And the world has got to come to terms with that. That India is going to be the first, second, or third power by the end of the century. Which of those three it will be is up for grabs. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd probably said China or America, but who knows?
Thank you.
Particularly who knows about America.
Thank you again. I just wanted to ask you, at that time back in the day, what was the appeal of Buddhism? Because when you look westwards, you see sort of more physical ways of enforcing someone's religious ideology. So how come Buddhism sort of spread without any sort of violent conflict? And maybe there was violent conflict that we don't know about.
So Buddhism spreads along the trade routes with the merchant classes, and it's very popular with merchants because it allows you to sort of greenwash your sins. You know, if you led a very ruthless business life, you can then give an enormous amount of money to the local Buddhist monastery, and your karma is wiped clean, and all is good. And it, on the contrary, Hinduism tends to spread to Southeast Asia to kings. And the kings do not like Buddhism because it's all about ahimsa and non-violence. And what's the point of being a non-violent medieval king when you're meant to be leading your generals in a brave Rajput, fighting your battles? But in the end, for reasons that are not easy to define, Hinduism wins in India and Buddhism wins in Southeast Asia. Initially, both are coexisting in both. So in India, you have many temples that are now Hindu temples, which once were Buddhist temples, like such as Badrinath, whose name means Bodrinath, as in Buddha. And in Southeast Asia, Angkor Wat is now a Buddhist temple, but was originally a Hindu one. But it's very difficult to understand why one won in one and one won the other.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the last 20 years of adventure that you've given me.
Thank you.
Through your books. And thank you for your son, too. I really appreciate
Ashna's going to get us both back next year.
I have a two-part question in Tritana manner. My first part is, how has the Kuladi and Adichanallur excavations and its links to the Saraswati civilization impacted you in the way you've seen the whole unraveling of trade and culture, and especially language? And the second part of it is, you spoke of how Ashoka was instrumental in the spread of Buddhism, rightly so. The Mahavamsa speaks of 3 instances when Buddha came to Sri Lanka, 2 of which was to settle disputes with the Naga kings in Kelaniya and in Nahadibam. You
Can we
did
get
not make
the
mention
question,
of it.
please?
How does that impact your theories of the spread of Buddhism?
So 2 different questions, 2 very different questions. One is, there's a whole, for those that didn't get the question, there's a whole set of excavations which is looking at the late Indus Valley period, when you get a desertification of areas that were once very fertile in Sindh, Gujarat and Haryana, and the end of the late Indus Valley civilization due to changing climate conditions. And again, this is not something I've dealt with in this book. I started after the Indus Valley, so it's not something I talk about here, but it's very interesting, obviously. And the trouble is that the ASI in India is now very heavily nationalized, and it's tending to validate pre-existing RSS ideas rather than have an intellectual independence. So there's a lot of nationalist spin with the excavation reports. There was a very good article in the Caravan about the RSS takeover of the ASI and how this is impacting scholarly integrity in the production of archaeological reports. So there's quite a lot of dispute between left and right and sort of JNU archaeologists against BJP archaeologists and so on. As for the Mahavamsa, spectacular text, incredibly useful, the foundation of all early Sri Lankan history, but it's not a history book in our sense, and there's no evidence that the Buddha left the Gangetic Plain in historical terms. These are wonderful stories of myth and miracle, not texts that we should take as historical in our sense.
Thanks.